The purpose of this screencast lecture is to introduce the rules governing revocation and firm offers. In this second part, we consider the more complex rules for construction bidding and for using contractual formalities to create a firm offer. We begin with a reliance-based theory that grows out of the now familiar promissory estoppel doctrine of Restatement Section 90. The basic outline of this rule closely mirrors what we've already seen for offers of unilateral contracts. The court in Pavel Enterprises refers to two seminal cases on construction bidding and rules governing enforcement of bids, Baird against Gimbel Brothers and Drennan against Star Paving. The Baird court refuses to enforce the subcontractor's bid, even though the subcontractor's error caused the general contractor's bid to be too low. On very similar facts, Drennan enforces a subcontractor's bid despite the sub's belated attempt to correct his error. Notice that even under the comparatively restrictive approach of Baird, the general contractor could purchase an option contract for consideration. But that's cumbersome and costly. The general contractor would need to negotiate an option with each supplier and subcontractor. So the rule of Drennan protects the general contractor without requiring an express option contract in exchange for consideration. The court relied on promissory estoppel and Restatement Section 90 to enforce the subcontractor's bid as an option contract. Because the general contractor relies on the subcontractor's bid in entering his own bid, then the sub's bid is enforceable as an option contract for prompt acceptance. The Pavel court idiosyncratically calls this approach the detrimental reliance theory, but most courts refer to promissory estoppel. The Drennan rule is now embodied in Restatement Section 87(2). If the offeror should reasonably expect his offer to induce reliance of a substantial character, then the offer is enforceable as an option. But this reliance-based enforcement is fraught with uncertainty. As we saw in our discussion of promissory estoppel doctrine, courts face many line-drawing problems. Thus we might hope that parties could use some more reliable means of creating an irrevocable offer. Both the Restatement and the UCC include provisions that respond to this need. Under the Restatement, if the offer is in writing, and I sign it, and it recites purported consideration for making the offer, and proposes an exchange on fair terms within a reasonable time, then my offer is enforceable as an option contract. So Section 87(1)(a) suggests that a pure formality can create an option. Perhaps unfortunately, cases often seem to require that the consideration be paid rather than just recited. Courts may feel uncomfortable enforcing a promise with sham consideration. But this reluctance forces parties to make an express option contract for genuine consideration, and that tendency eliminates the benefit of a purely formal device for creating a firm offer. Under the UCC, however, parties routinely use Section 2205 to create firm offers with no consideration. This section requires an express guarantee of a firm offer in a signed writing from a merchant for 3 months or less, and it must be separately signed if it's on the offeree's form. Under Section 2205, no consideration is required. But this rule applies only to transactions involving goods. Note also that the parties can pay consideration to create a firm offer that lasts longer than 3 months, but that's just an express option contract. Now let's return to the reliance-based enforcement theory of Drennan and Pavel Enterprises. A few commentators have criticized Drennan because the rule creates an obligation for the sub even though the general contractor makes no commitment to the subcontractor. Some have said, quoting Baird, that there's not the least reason to believe that the defendant meant to subject itself to such a one-sided obligation. This argument is reminiscent of Wormser's analysis of unilateral contract offers, and his insistence on symmetric obligations. How might we answer this criticism? Does the Pavel opinion have anything to say on this point? Well, in paragraph 18, the court quotes Drennan for the idea that the sub wants to help the general contractor obtain the contract. Apparently the theory is that if the general contractor can rely, it makes the contract award more likely. But notice that subs often submit bids to many or all of the general contractors bidding on a particular project. Thus it's less than clear that they care who wins. A far better explanation is that the Drennan rule leads to optimal precautions by the subcontractor. If even an erroneous bid will be enforced, then the subcontractor has a strong incentive to take care in computing his bid. It also seems likely that the sub has a comparative advantage in taking precautions against errors in preparing a bid. Thus we assign liability here to the cheapest cost avoider. Notice, though, that the practical effect of the Drennan approach is to give the general contractor an option. We know that an option is valuable, and so we also need to impose appropriate limits on this option. Thinking about Pavel Enterprises, what constraints need to be imposed on the rights that this sort of firm offer creates? There's an extensive discussion of bidding strategy in Pavel in paragraphs 21 and 49. As you can see from the court's opinion, it requires a careful analysis of the facts to decide whether to enforce or not. The first limitation the court imposes bars certain conduct by the general contractor. No bid shopping, chopping, or peddling is allowed. This constraint prevents the offeree, the general contractor, from trying to take strategic advantage of the offeror, the subcontractor. Remember that under the promissory estoppel theory, the general contractor claims to have relied on the subcontractor's bid. Thus, the general contractor cannot reopen bidding or negotiate with other potential subcontractors, as Pavel Enterprises appears to have done. If any of these practices were to become ubiquitous, then the subcontractor's initial bids would be meaningless. Construction costs would probably rise because no one would bid aggressively during the initial phase. They'd wait to work out deals until after the general contractor had already been awarded. So there are good systemic reasons to avoid this outcome. A second important limitation is the requirement of prompt acceptance after award of the general contract. This temporal constraint reduces the risk that the general contractor will shop around for better terms. Thus, it's closely related to the rule against bid shopping. But prompt acceptance is far easier to verify. Finally, if the offeree has either actual or constructive notice of a mistake in the offer, then the offeree cannot enforce it for later acceptance. In these circumstances, it's no longer reasonable to rely on the offer. And since this promissory estoppel approach is built on reasonable reliance, an obvious mistake eliminates that foundation. Notice that the approach in Drennan and Pavel illustrates once again a form of comparative advantage analysis, and produces yet another compound liability rule. In the first instance, we think that subcontractors can more cheaply take precautions against making errors in their own bids. Protecting the general contractor's reliance gives subs a strong incentive to take care. But if the general knows, or has reason to know, that the sub has made a mistake, then we shift responsibility to the general, who can now cheaply avoid the loss. A classic example of a compound liability rule. So that brings us to the end of this group of related doctrines. Here again is a table summarizing all of them. Thanks for listening.